She stood solitary on a frigid, desolate street, rain drenching her shivering form, tears cascading down her cheeks. A wealthy man cast his pregnant wife out of their home, showing no remorse or hesitation, yet she remained unyielding. 2 decades later, she came back, not in pursuit of vengeance, nor pleading for resolution, but bearing a truth so profound it would upend his entire existence. The events that unfolded next surpassed all expectations. Before we dive in, please give this video a thumbs up and share your location in the comments. Your support enables us to share more impactful narratives. Let us commence. The night enveloped her in an unprecedented chill. She lingered on the threshold, hands cradling her rounded abdomen, her breath forming delicate clouds in the biting cold. The imposing door had just banged closed before her eyes. She rapped once more, her hands quaking, her voice faltering as she implored. Yet, there was emptiness. No reply. There is an absence of warmth. The man inside showed no signs of remorse, only quietude, the type of quiet that whispered she was no longer a part of that place. As the rain cascaded down her face, tears mingled with the droplets as she turned away. She found herself without a destination, without family. She had no friends willing to offer her a place to stay. The man who had once vowed to cherish her eternally had cast her aside as if she were insignificant. He possessed everything: wealth, influence, opulence. She possessed nothing but the child developing within her. Now her survival was paramount, not for her own sake but for the existence she nurtured. She trudged on for hours, her body weary, fatigue weighing heavily on her limbs. The distant city lights twinkled, yet she found herself without a haven. Vehicles sped past, their beams of light briefly revealing her drenched figure. Yet no one intervened. No one seemed to care. The world continued its course, oblivious to her pain. Her previously flawless existence had shattered in the span of a single evening. A quaint diner lingered at the street's corner, its neon sign flickering feebly. Summoning her final reserves of energy, she forced the door open. The warmth enveloped her like a gentle tide, and for a fleeting instant, she experienced a sense of solace. The waitress at the counter shot her a wary, hesitant glance, yet remained silent. She nestled into the corner booth, focusing on calming her breath, attempting to push aside the ache in her chest. A gentle-faced man, likely in his 60s, came closer. He set a cup of tea before her, his gaze brimming with silent comprehension. "It seems you might benefit from a touch of compassion," he remarked gently. She was unable to hold back the tears that streamed down her face. That night, she found herself in a shelter, enveloped by the presence of unfamiliar faces. It wasn't home, yet it held a significance, and in that instant, that significance transformed into sufficiency. Yet, she remained unaware that life still had more in store for her. The coming years would challenge her resilience in ways she could never foresee, and 2 decades later, she would find herself back at the threshold where it all started. This time, she would stand her ground, refusing to plead. 2 decades had slipped away, yet the anguish of that evening lingered on, refusing to diminish. Each challenge, each drop of sorrow, each night spent awake had shaped the woman she was now. She had transformed from the desperate, broken girl standing in the rain. She had battled for existence, scraped her way out of the shadows, and crafted a life from the ground up, and now she had returned. She stood outside the imposing mansion, the very site where she had been discarded as if she held no value. Yet she held value. That's a thing of the past. Her heart raced, yet she stood firm, unwilling to waver. Taking a moment to gather her thoughts, she moved ahead and pressed the doorbell. After a brief pause, the heavy door let out a creaking sound as it slowly opened. A housekeeper lingered, her visage unknown. She regarded the woman before her with intrigue, perceiving an oddity in her demeanor. "I must see him," she declared, her voice unwavering. The housekeeper paused, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "Do you have a scheduled meeting?" A wry smile flickered across her lips. "Absolutely." For him, every detail needed to be meticulously planned, organized, and managed. However, this is not the case. Simply inform him that an old acquaintance has arrived, she instructed, and that he will rue the day if he chooses not to answer the door. A brief glimmer of doubt crossed the housekeeper's gaze before she vanished into the shadows of the house. The woman remained still, the frigid air nipping at her skin. It had an unsettling sense of familiarity. Yet this time she stood firm. She was not pleading. She lingered in anticipation. Moments later, the sound of footsteps drew near. Then the door creaked open wider. And there he stood. Time had transformed him. His hair had taken on a shade of gray. His visage had weathered with time. Yet, the pride reflected in his gaze remained unchanged. The very eyes that had regarded her with indifference 2 decades prior. Yet there was something more at play. There's an undercurrent waiting to be discovered. A spark of familiarity. He parted his lips, poised to utter a word. Yet silence prevailed. She noticed the bewilderment in his gaze, the effort to recognize the woman in front of him. And then, she uttered the words that fractured the atmosphere. 2 decades have passed since you cast me aside. You abandoned me completely, and now I find myself here. His face lost color for a moment, but he concealed it swiftly. What is it that you desire? His voice cut through the air, precise and measured. She allowed the silence to linger, observing him, making sure he sensed the gravity of her presence. At last, she found her voice. My intentions were not driven by financial gain. I did not arrive seeking retribution. I have something to share with you. Catalyst for transformation. For the very first time, she laid her eyes upon it. A fissure in his flawless demeanor. A glimmer of trepidation. And she understood deep within that he felt it as well. His reality was on the brink of transformation. He remained motionless, his hands firmly clutching the door's edge. For the first time, the unwavering confidence he had always possessed appeared to falter. In his eyes, she witnessed the clash of curiosity and fear. This moment stood apart for a man who had dedicated his life to mastering every result. This was an unexpected turn of events for him. She advanced with purpose, her eyes unwavering. The passage of time had stripped away much, yet it had also forged her resilience. She had journeyed too far to allow doubt to impede her progress now. You never inquired about what transpired with me, she remarked. Not a single time. You cast me aside, and that was the end of it. Have you ever pondered the fate of the child you left behind? His expression wavered, stunned, incredulity, perhaps something more profound. Yet he concealed it just as swiftly. I don't have time for this, he said, his voice cutting through the air, tinged with a hint of defensiveness. If you're here to revisit old wounds, you're simply squandering your time. She released a soft chuckle, yet it held no trace of amusement. The past, she echoed. Do you believe this pertains to what has already happened? His jaw clenched. He attempted to maintain his composure, yet she could perceive the fissures beginning to appear. He desired her absence. He wished for this dialogue to conclude before it had the chance to start. I have something to share that could transform your existence, she pressed on. And regardless of your desire to hear it, you will pay attention. A heavy stillness enveloped the space between them. After a long time, she finally felt a sense of control in this scenario. She was not the fragile, shattered figure he had cast aside. She had become impossible for him to overlook. He let out a sharp breath, his hand moving to rub over his face. Very well, he murmured. Go ahead and express what you need to express. She inhaled deeply. This was the moment, the instant she had envisioned for countless years. Yet, in this moment, the weight of the words was more profound than she had anticipated. Your son, she said, observing his response intently. The one you never bothered to inquire about. He is more than an ordinary man. He is a person worth your acquaintance. His brows knitted together, yet an additional layer lingered beneath the surface. Something elusive, just beyond her grasp. What are you referring to? He inquired. She delved into her bag and retrieved a photograph, presenting it for his gaze. His gaze fell upon it, and for the first time, Genuine emotion danced across his features. He gazed at the image, his breath catching momentarily. A young man stood before me, exuding strength and confidence. His eyes strikingly familiar, impossible to overlook. He was raised in your absence, she remarked. He was once unnecessary to you, yet now he has become impossible to overlook. His fingers danced with a subtle restlessness, his gaze flitting between the photograph and her expression. Who might he be? His voice had softened, carrying a hint of hesitation. She moved in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that made each word resonate powerfully. He is your son, she declared, and he possesses a strength greater than you ever had. His breath hitched, fingers clenching the door tighter. She was able to perceive it, the dread, the understanding, the burden of her recent revelation. Everything in his world had just shifted, and for the first time in his life, he found himself devoid of control. The hue faded from his complexion as he gazed at the photograph, his fingers clenching the edges tighter, as though the image could vanish if he relaxed his hold. His lips parted just a fraction, yet silence lingered in the air. It was the inaugural moment she witnessed him rendered utterly without words. The formidable, self-assured figure who had once wielded power over all now found himself immobilized, struggling to grasp the enormity of her revelation. She observed him intently, allowing the silence to linger in the space that separated them. This was the moment she had envisioned for countless years, the moment when he would at last comprehend the weight of his actions. Yet, in its arrival, there was an absence of fulfillment, no taste of triumph, just the undeniable reality that could no longer be overlooked. At last, he compelled himself to utter a word. This is simply not feasible. His voice wavered, taking on an unfamiliar quality. She exhaled softly, her face a mask of mystery. You can convince yourself of anything, she remarked, but the truth remains indifferent to your beliefs. His gaze flicked back to the photograph. The young man gazing back at him possessed his jawline, his eyes, an unmistakable quality in his expression. He bore a striking resemblance to him. Beyond that, he appeared to be someone who commanded unwavering acceptance. Who is that person? He inquired, his tone softer this time. Her eyes remained steadfast. He inhaled sharply, shaking his head as if to dispel the harsh truth that lay before him. Where could he be? She inclined her head ever so slightly, observing him intently. What makes it important to you? Something shimmered in his gaze, a feeling she couldn't fully identify. Could it have been remorse? Apprehension? Remorse? I have a right to know, he asserted, his voice regaining a hint of its former edge. If this is indeed the case, I have a right to be informed. She moved in a bit, softening her tone so that each word landed with impact. You are entitled to nothing. His jaw tightened, yet he refrained from contesting her words, for within him, he recognized the truth of her statement. She inhaled deeply, finding her composure. He was raised in your absence, she remarked. He had no need for you. He transformed into a unique presence, and now he is impossible to overlook. His brows knitted together, a veil of doubt shadowing his face. Could you clarify what you mean? She retrieved another photograph, this one depicting a man positioned in front of a building. No, not just any structure, a corporation. A name stood out in bold letters above the entrance. A name that caused him to take a sharp breath. It was his very own surname. He abruptly lifted his gaze, his eyes probing hers for clarity, yet she remained silent. She merely observed as understanding washed over him, as the reality took hold. His son had not merely endured, he had flourished. He had created something formidable, something irrefutable, and now, whether he embraced it or not, he found himself in its shadow. He let out a slow breath, his voice wavering. Does he really own this? She gave a slight nod. He created it from the ground up. His hands quivered ever so slightly, clutching the photograph as though it contained the key to all mysteries. Is he aware of my existence? She paused briefly before responding. He possesses sufficient knowledge. His eyes clouded with intensity. Is he upset with me? She hesitated before responding. Rather, she allowed the quiet to convey its own message, and within that stillness, he grasped the meaning. This was more than a mere gathering. It was a pivotal moment, and everything would change from here on out. His fingers quivered gently as he followed the strong letters on the photograph, his own last name reflecting back at him like a specter from days gone by. It was more than just a company. It was a multi-million-dollar empire, the result of years of unwavering dedication, and it belonged to the son he had left behind. A profound stillness enveloped the space, heavy with the weight of countless untold stories. He had devoted his existence to the illusion of control, convinced that his choices were absolute, that the past could be laid to rest. Yet now it loomed before him, inescapable and resolute. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. Is he aware of my presence? She nodded deliberately, observing his every response with keen interest. Indeed he does. His jaw clenched, yet his gaze remained fixed on the photograph. Years had slipped by as he feigned ignorance of the past, assuring himself that leaving it behind was the correct choice. Yet here he was, engulfed by the very shadow of what he had sought to obliterate. A sharp rap on the door caused his breath to catch in his throat. She remained still. She observed him intently, biding her time. His heartbeat thudded in his ears as he faced the door, each step weighing down on him more than the one before. As he extended his hand towards the handle, a sheen of perspiration glistened on his palms. He had confronted boardrooms brimming with merciless executives, had made choices that obliterated rivals, had forged his own empire solely through his relentless drive. Yet this was unlike anything else. He found himself in a moment that slipped through his fingers. He swung the door open. Before him stood a man, tall and strong, exuding a quiet confidence that captured the focus of all around. His defined features, his intense gaze, it was undeniable. This was his offspring. For an extended pause, silence enveloped them both. They gazed at one another, as though seeking something elusive, as if attempting to grasp what remained forever beyond explanation. At last, his son moved ahead, his tone composed and unwavering. So, you are the one who abandoned my mother, leaving her with nothing. The words held no anger, nor did they rise in volume, yet they bore the profound weight of 2 decades. His throat was parched. He yearned to articulate his thoughts, to clarify, to justify his actions. Yet silence prevailed. His son regarded him for a moment longer, then retrieved something from his pocket, a neatly folded piece of paper. He passed it silently without uttering a single word. With trembling hands he opened it up. His gaze swept over the text, a sharp intake of breath escaping him as he absorbed the lines. A formal text, a proposal, or perhaps a cautionary note. His son had not arrived here in pursuit of answers. He had not arrived with the intention of mending things. He arrived with authority, with dominance, with the ultimate decision. In an instant, the man who once believed himself invincible now found himself vulnerable, facing the very son he had left behind. His hands quivered while gripping the document, his gaze meticulously traversing each word. The burden of it was overwhelming. It was more than a mere legal proposition. It was a bold proclamation, an unmistakable assertion that the son he had forsaken now wielded all the authority. He compelled himself to raise his gaze, his throat parched. His son stood before him, resolute, poised in anticipation. His expression held no trace of anger or bitterness. Instead, it radiated a quiet strength that unmistakably conveyed he sought no vengeance. It was unnecessary for him. He had already triumphed. His voice wavered. What is this all about? His son tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady and inscrutable. It is a decision. His heart raced within him. An option. The irony of it nearly brought a chuckle to his lips. For years, he had held the conviction that he was the architect of his own choices, the one who determined destinies. He had departed with the belief that his choice was conclusive, yet now the dynamics had changed. His son pointed at the paper. I created something from scratch. I took the steps you were unwilling to take, and now I'm extending an invitation for you to join in, but it will require a sacrifice on your part. His hold on the document grew firmer. What type of expense are we discussing? His son's demeanor stayed unwavering. By signing this, you relinquish all that you once identified with, your name, your status, your wealth. You begin anew, not as the architect of a vast empire, but as an individual ready to prove their worth. A quick breath slipped from his lips. The proposal was harsh. It would take away all that he had devoted his life to pursuing, yet paradoxically, it was the sole path ahead. His eyes darted to the woman positioned behind his son. Her silence spoke volumes, and he sensed the heavy burden of her past, the traces of hardship and resilience carved into her features. She had endured in his absence. She had nurtured a son in his absence, and now she observed him, anticipating whether he could transform. A tightness gripped his throat. What if I choose not to comply? The expression on his son's face remained unchanged. Then you turn and leave once more, yet this time, there is no return. The conclusion of it sent a shiver through him. He understood instinctively that this was not a matter of bargaining. It was not a request for mending ties. It was an experiment. For the first time in his life, he found himself at the precipice of the unknown, compelled to make a choice that could alter the course of everything. His fingers gripped the paper with intensity. For decades, he clung to the notion that only wealth and power held any significance. Yet, as he stood there, gazing into the eyes of the son he had never known, a profound realization washed over him. He had been so very mistaken. The inquiry was whether he possessed the bravery to acknowledge it.